What a painful sight for President Vladimir Putin. The troops he sent to Syria to shore up Russian influence in the Middle East 9 years ago, forced to retreat, moving in convoy along the road north from Damascus this morning. For Syrians watching them pass, not so painful. Without Russian support, Bashar al-Assad would probably have fallen long ago.
Tell me what you're feeling watching the Russians go past.
نصر كبير وفرحة الحمد لله قتلونا ودمرونا الحمد لله.
We passed scores of vehicles, a column that continued for several kilometers, an organized retreat. And then they were forced to stop. One vehicle with a flat tire, and they all ground to a halt. The Russian military is notoriously camera shy, but today avoiding us was a low priority, although they didn't want to talk. At their height, the Russians had some 5,000 troops on the ground in Syria. Many were withdrawn when they invaded Ukraine in 2022. Here they were infamous for the destruction they wreaked from the air. But that's all over. The rebels they've been fighting are now the ones in power.
The Russian column has just set off again. It took them nearly 2 hours to sort out one flat tire. What we can see is that they are leaving in good order. They don't look like a defeated army. They must have come to some kind of agreement with the new authorities in Damascus. But we've seen more than 150 vehicles. It gives an idea of how huge the Russian presence in Syria was.
They turned onto the road to Latakia and Tartus, where the Russians have an air base and a naval port. Transport aircraft and frigates have been spotted there, suggesting these forces are to be withdrawn to Russia. In Damascus, the new Prime Minister was fighting through not Russians, but crowds of well-wishers to get into the Umayyad Mosque for Friday prayers. During the scenes of mass jubilation, the man who led the militia that toppled Assad, shedding both his jihadi name and uniform, put out a statement calling for sober and responsible celebration.
أود أن أبارك للشعب السوري العظيم انتصار الثورة المباركة وأدعوهم للنزول إلى الميادين للتعبير عن فرحتهم بذلك دون إطلاق الرصاص وترويع الناس ثم بعد ذلك لنتجه إلى بناء هذا البلد وكما قلناها منذ البداية منصورة بعون الله والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
And head to the squares they did after Friday prayers. The biggest crowds were in Damascus, but all over the country people came out to celebrate the downfall of the Assad regime just 5 days ago. So much has happened since then, an entire nation transformed, looking back in pain and forward in hope. Syrians may be happy to see the Russians go, but other regional powers are jostling to take their place, stepping into the void left by decades of dictatorship and war.
And Lindsey joins us now from the city of Homs. Lindsey.
Aisha, it might be nice to think that Syrians could be masters of their own fate, that they could choose what kind of government they wanted and that would be that. But of course, that's not how the world works. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been in Turkey and in Iraq over the last 2 days. They're very worried. On the one hand, the Americans, of course, are thrilled to see the Russians being pushed back along with Hezbollah and the Iranians. On the other hand, they're very worried that this new dispensation in Syria will lead to the rise of al-Qaeda and ISIS again. And of course, the new leader, Ahmed al-Farah, used to be called al-Julani under his nom de guerre, is still sanctioned. So that the Americans aren't quite sure what to do. You've got the Israelis bombing, you've got the Turks bombing because of the Kurds. And then what about the Russians? Now, that port at Tartus is very important to the Russians. They want to keep it because it's from there, it's their jumping off point for all of what they're doing in Africa. Of course, remember how in the Sahel in West Africa, Russia is increasingly influential. And there are 2 ships loaded with wheat for Syria off the port at the moment. That is the Russians' bargaining chip. It may not be so easy for the new Syrian government to get rid of the Russians as they would like.
Lindsey, thank you. Lindsey Hilsum in Homs there. While many Syrians celebrate, others continue their desperate search for loved ones disappeared by Assad's brutal regime. When the doors of the country's prisons were thrown open, it led to joyful reunions for some, but heartbreak for others. And many are still searching for answers, clinging to the hope that their missing relatives are alive, as our Foreign Affairs correspondent Porrick O'Brien explains in this report, which contains graphic and upsetting images.
Bashar al-Assad's father enlisted a former Nazi officer to design his intelligence and torture operation. One of its pillars, Sednaya prison. Thousands freed from there on Sunday. Now imagine what it would have been like in the days after the Nazi concentration camps were liberated. Imagine the surrounding hospitals and morgues filling up, the search for the missing. Tragically, no need to imagine anymore. All day long outside al-Mushtahid hospital, people come to try to find their loved ones among the pictures of the dead. Khader's father was detained 12 years ago. His face is not on the wall, so still no closure.
انت قد ما رح تحكي انت ما رح تحسني توصفي اي شعور جواتك 12 سنه انت عايشه بعرق كبيره ما بتعرفي عنه شيء انت عم تاكلي بس ما عندك.
Inside the hospital morgue, people step around the corpses on the floor. Some have been detained for so long they look different. Aging and torture makes them harder to identify. The deputy coroner explains.
لقينا في حالات طلق ناري بالمنطقة القفوية بالصدر لقينا حالات تعذيب in this room.
After 12 years of war, Dr. Al-Qasim has seen a lot, but this is different.
يعني في منظر أنا كأطباء شرعيين نحن مر علينا سابقا بالسنوات السابقة مر علينا حالات كثيرة فينا نقول إنه هذا عذب أو فينا نقول إنه هذا كذا ولكن مثل هيك لسه نحن يعني في مفاجآت كثيرة ما بنعرفها.
At another hospital, Ibn al-Nafis, we hear there's a freed prisoner being treated. We pass another notice board for the would-be bereaved.
There are just 10 detainees in this hospital. Yesterday, this is the list of people who put their names down saying they'd lost loved ones that they were looking for.
Inside, the former detainees' room is full of people. More keep coming. The man they're talking about doesn't speak. He appears severely mentally impaired. No one knows his name.
بس بيشبه اخي مشان هيك يا خالي بس شوي.
He cannot give consent to be filmed by us, but his doctors told us to publicize his presence here. In the absence of DNA testing kits, there is no way to identify him.
أنا عندي هي أمه هلا بتقول إنه أمه ومتأكدة وهي بتقول عمه جاي من مركز.
Some are convinced that he's the son that they lost. They are one of the hundreds of thousands of imprisoned or disappeared by the regime.
تمام نحن بالمشفى من يوم الأحد تقريبا اليوم اللي وصلنا ما يتجاوزوا 10 أشخاص كل شخص اجى فاقد ذاكرته عم تتعرف عليه اكثر من عيله، اكثر من 6-7 عيال عم تجي. في شخص وصلوا ل 100 عائله او 100 شخص تعرف عليه على اساس انه قريبه.
We don't know how severe this man's condition was before Sednaya prison. We do know that the torture administered there was of the most extreme kind. Torture that continues for those holding on to the hope of connecting to those they love.